Welcome to the Arabic Hour. I'm Susan Akram, clinical professor at Boston University School of Law. Today I will be speaking with Wissam Ahmed of AlHaq and SAHAR FRANCIS of ADDAMEER, who will be discussing the recent Israeli decision to designate their organizations and 4 other prominent Palestinian non-governmental organizations as terrorist organizations, the reasons behind the decision, and its consequences. Let me start with introducing our guests. SAHAR FRANCIS is the General Director of Ramallah-based ADDAMEER Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, a Palestinian NGO providing legal and advocacy support to Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli and Palestinian prisons. An attorney by training, she joined the association in 1998, first as a human rights lawyer, then as head of the legal unit. SAHAR has over 20 years of human rights experience. She did her practice on human rights in the Society of Saint Yves in Jerusalem on issues of land confiscation, house demolitions, labor rights, and freedom of movement, and in 1997 worked with BADIL Refugee Rights Center legal unit. Welcome, SAHAR.
Thank you.
Wissam Ahmed is a Palestinian American born and raised in the United States. He has a BA and Juris Doctor from Louisiana State University and an LLM from the Irish Center for Human Rights in Galway. He's been working as a human rights advocate with AlHaq since 2006, where he's now the director of the Applied Center for International Law and coordinator of AlHaq's Business and Human Rights program. His area of research is on the economic incentive structure perpetuating the colonization of Palestine along business lines. Welcome, Wissam.
Thank you very much, Susan. Pleasure.
Let's start with you, SAHAR. Could you tell our audience about the history and work of ADDAMEER?
As you mentioned, I joined ADDAMEER in 1998, actually, as a lawyer, representing Palestinian political prisoners in the military court system of the occupation and in the civil system as well, doing visitation for prisons, documenting torture, ill treatment, and harassment against these prisoners. And actually, since then, the organization and me myself developed in more the advocacy and joining the other Palestinian human rights organizations in the international advocacy, especially on the UN level and the diplomat level, whether in the EU or in other states, to advocate on behalf of the Palestinian political prisoners. Also, ADDAMEER is following the cases of Palestinian prisoners arrested by the Palestinian Authority as well. And we are doing trainings and raising awareness programs for students, for the public in general about the imprisonment, the torture, and the procedures, especially before the Israeli military court system. In all these years working with ADDAMEER, I was involved in much human rights work, not just on the issue of Palestinian prisoners, but against the occupation policies and war crimes and crimes against humanity, especially in the level of the international criminal law and accountability question and how to seek justice within the tools that offered with the international law system in these years.
One of the important factors that I think you've highlighted about both ADDAMEER's work and AlHaq's work is the international prominence that you have had in raising the issues of your focus at the United Nations, in many public international fora. And I want to come back to the importance of that aspect of both of your work as it relates to this recent decision by the Israeli government. So let me ask you, Wissam, if you could describe AlHaq's history and a bit of its work as well.
Sure, Susan. I've been with AlHaq since 2006, and it's been a privilege and an honor to be with AlHaq. AlHaq is the first Palestinian human rights organization. It was established in 1979 by a group of Palestinian lawyers that saw the tool of law as being instrumental in challenging the occupation. And it was at the time of institutionalization of the human rights regime at the time with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights coming into force, and an opportunity for Palestinian advocates to develop the use of international law. And since that time, over the last 40 plus years, AlHaq's work has evolved from documenting violations, looking at individual and collective rights of the Palestinian people, irrespective of the identity of the perpetrator, looking also at violations of the Palestinian Authority since they came into being as well. And our work has evolved to do more advocacy at the international level. As you mentioned, AlHaq has special consultative status with the United Nations and regularly presents at the UN and the Human Rights Council on Israeli violations. And over the course of the time, the tool of international law is one that we have developed our ability to use and refine. And it is not simply about raising the issues of the violations that are happening, but also to have international law enforced and respected and hold the perpetrators accountable. And that's where we have begun to push the boundaries of international law, simply something that is written on paper, and putting it to application within the mechanisms that the international community has created and designated as the proper path to follow for the realization of the right to self-determination. And these tools are the ones that the Palestinian civil society and AlHaq in particular are using to push forward that realization.
Thank you. So that's a really wonderful background to the important question here, which is, why was AlHaq and ADDAMEER and the other 4 organizations, why were they designated terrorist organization? Maybe Sahar, you can begin with talking a bit about the background to that decision and how you learned about it and what it is about these 6 organizations that led Israel to take that decision.
Maybe it's very important to highlight that the attack against the Palestinian civil society didn't start just with the latest decision of designating the 6 Palestinian organizations. It's long history of Israeli harassment and attack against the Palestinian civil society, and it depends on the political circumstances. We cannot forget the fact that Israel illegalized tens of Palestinian organizations in Jerusalem city back when the Palestinian Authority was established in the late 90s, in order to put effect that the Palestinian Authority cannot exist. So, for example, the Orient House then was shut down and closed, and other 10 organizations, including prisoners' organizations and other human rights issues. So the attack against the ADDAMEER, AlHaq, and the other 4 organizations started a couple of years ago with a smear campaign led by right-wing Israeli groups like NGO Monitor, UK Lawyers for Israel, Im Tirtzu, Shurat Adin, and other NGOs that they were following the kind of work that these organizations and other organizations actually involved in, and attacking us, trying to distribute false information and false allegations against these organizations, mainly in order to affect our donors. The aim was to dry our resources and by this to silence us. And all these efforts failed. So this is why this step of taking legal decision against these organizations came this year. after they claimed that they collected more evidences that could be presented. We should highlight that the same evidences they referred for was submitted for the Europeans in a secret dossier that they rejected back in May 2021. And then in October, they decided to use the Israeli anti-terror law of 2016 to designate the 6 organizations. And of course, this is, and maybe my colleague Wissam can elaborate more on the kind of the shift in the international legal level, the tools that we are using more and more in the last 10 years as organizations, the language, the context of the accountability that we are trying to seek via the different campaigns that these organizations, the fact that some of these organizations are implementing work in Area C that is very sensitive for the occupation, for the future plans of annexing this area to the occupying power and so on. This is actually the reasons behind designating the organizations.
Sahar, what you have really pointed out is that this has been a decision that has been in the works or long in the making before it actually came to this final terrorist organization designation, which is, I think, a really important point for our audience to understand that there have been a series of policies and laws before this to try to censor or silence a number of organizations, the latest of which are these 6. And perhaps, as Sahar suggests, Wissam, you could describe a bit more about the decision itself, the 2016 law, and something about the effect that this is having on AlHaq, ADDAMEER, and the other organizations.
Thank you, Susan. And to follow up on what Sahar mentioned, that this process of attacking and trying to stifle the work of Palestinian civil society is something that has been ongoing for years. But it's also important to keep in mind that this attack on Palestinian civil society today is part of a much bigger policy of colonialism that has been implemented on the Palestinian people for decades. And civil society, we play a role in being an obstacle to the implementation of that policy. And over the decades, their use of different tools and means and methods to prevent Palestinian civil society from functioning has evolved. At the same time, it's an ongoing dynamic process where our refinement of those tools has also evolved to counter those policies. And in recent years, specifically with regard to mechanisms that have made Israel uncomfortable, such as the use of the International Criminal Court, the use of the Convention Against Apartheid, challenging the economic incentive structure that perpetuates the colonization of Palestine through the areas of business and human rights, for example. All of these have been instrumental in challenging Israel's policy and making it more difficult for them to implement that policy. And we've been able to challenge the policy by confronting the impunity that Israel has enjoyed, the narrative of adherence to democratic values and the rule of law, and finally following the money. And when these issues start making Israel uncomfortable, the recent moves can be seen as simply a reaction to the source of that discomfort and trying to remove it. And so the organizations that have been designated of late are in a long line of other civil society actors that have played a role in preventing Israel's policy and have served as an obstacle to its implementation. And Israel today is trying to remove that obstacle. And its actions are making our work more challenging, for sure. But challenges are something that we are used to seeing and used to overcoming as well. And we see this latest attack using the 2016 anti-terrorism law, which is in and of itself an evolution of the process of the use of the law to stifle Palestinian civil society. We see this move as Sahar alluded to, a last-ditch effort to take a sledgehammer to Palestinian civil society when the European Union and other actors were not listening to their smear campaigns, were not listening to their allegations, and they continue to support Palestinian civil society. Israel is trying to take out of their hands the decision and simply quash Palestinian civil society's ability to operate and function using this terrorist designation, and primarily targeting the financial network through which Palestinian civil society is able to receive support and funding from the international community.
You've both raised a lot of points that I'd like to follow up on, but I think for our audience, perhaps that may be less familiar with the decision itself, maybe either Sahar or Wissam, you could say exactly what the decision was and what the implications in terms of your actual day-to-day work are. Either of you who wants to take that.
Maybe I'll cover the legal aspect of the decision and both systems, legal systems that were used. So in October, actually, the Israeli Minister of Defense issued his decision based on the 2016 anti-terror law that the 6 organizations actually are terrorist organizations. And it's based on, of course, secret information. And as Wissam said, it's a use of Israeli civil law over the occupied territories that it's a violation by itself for the international humanitarian law. And he has no authority or jurisdiction to designate Palestinian organizations registered according to the Palestinian law in the Palestinian territories under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority as terrorist organizations, and totally ignoring the role of the Palestinian Authority in all this issue as well, and claiming, and this is the very important point, that the whole claim against us that we are channeling money to a terrorist organization. If it's supposed to be investigated, and according to our annual reports, it should be the work of the Palestinian Authority investigative bodies in this case. And after 3 weeks after this decision, the military governor as well, because actually one of the points we raised that the minister has no authority to designate us as terrorist organizations. So they used as well the military orders that they developed in order to use in the occupied territories. And the military governor issued as well a decision based on the military orders. But here there's a slight difference, that we are not designated as terrorist organizations according to the military orders, but rather illegal entities. Both are resulting to the fact that we cannot continue basically our work, and we have to stop our work immediately with the knowledge about the decisions. In reality, none of the organizations were informed properly that such steps were taken. We discovered about both from the media, and especially the decision of the minister on Friday. It was published via a statement from the ministry on Friday in the weekend, and we discovered from the media that we were declared as a terrorist organizations. In both procedures, the decision would be based on secret information. So the organizations are represented by ADALA Legal Center and Michael Sfard representing AlHaq. And we referred to the military governor in order to request the material and the evidences that were used as a base for such decisions. Last week, we were informed that most of the decision was based on the secret information that we will never get. It will never be disclosed for us, but we can copy the public material. We copied the public material, and I can assure you that nothing in the material that was submitted to ADALA last week is really convicting or can cause for convictions against any of the organizations or against any of the personnel working in these organizations. So we will continue in our fight in the legal level against the use of secret information, because we claim by basing such serious decision based on secret information, it will affect our right for due process as organizations, how we are supposed to defend ourselves while we don't know what's the facts that in their hands that could prove and justify such serious allegations. Of course, the direct impact on our work, it's very serious. I'll just refer to ADDAMEER and allow Wissam to describe the effect, the impact on AlHaq. In our case, it's a very serious impact because we are daily in a need of representing Palestinian prisoners in front of the Israeli military court system and in visitation programs to the interrogation detention facilities and prisons. And we cannot do it anymore in the name of the organization, because this would be a very clear violation for such by itself. It would be considered a crime against any of the lawyers, because this would be supporting terrorism and a terrorist organization. So this has affected our legal work in a very serious way. Of course, taking in as well the fact that we all continued working under the threat that we could be arrested any moment. Our offices could be raided and they can confiscate all the property. And if any of the organizations have other cars or other equipments, or they can confiscate everything, they can freeze our bank accounts. And it's like in every communication, they reiterate the fact that we should implement the orders immediately. But so far, none of these steps were taken against the organizations.
You've pointed out so many irregularities and perhaps illegalities in the issuance and the carrying out of the order itself, both under international law and it sounds like under Israeli domestic law as well. But the point about the evidence that Israel has, and the fact that the evidence is being kept secret and deliberately, presumably classified as secret in some way, must have an effect on what Israel is presenting to other countries in order to follow up on this designation. Perhaps, Wissam, you could talk a little bit about how this evidence is being presented to the international community of states and what the reaction has been on that level.
Well, Susan, I mean, I can only attest to what we hear members of the international community saying, that the evidence that they have seen is very much along the same lines of previous allegations, and they haven't felt that any evidence has been presented to substantiate and justify these designations. But again, you know, we are not privy to all the information that might be shared with members of the international community. And really what it does is it reinforces the context that we are in. We are an occupied population, and the occupying power using its ability to create the law that fits its narrative and impose the restrictions that it it wants within this context of an asymmetrical power balance. And the judicial mechanism is just one of the pillars of that process and policy of colonialism. In a functioning judicial system where due process takes a leading role, it's justice that's supposed to be blind and the evidence speak for itself. In our context, it is those that are accused are also blindfolded and prevented from being able to defend themselves within this system that is part and parcel of the oppression that it faces. And so, I mean, it's not surprising that Israel uses this tool, because we know that the allegations are unfounded, and the only way that it is able to ensure that the veracity of its allegations are not undermined and exposed is for it to maintain this position that the evidence is secret and no one can challenge us because we have the power to assert this. And this is the position. And that's why in this context of an asymmetrical power balance, it is incumbent upon the international community to play a more important role in countering this, because as the Palestinian population, as protected persons under international humanitarian law, the international community has an obligation to protect Palestinian society from its occupying power, and continuing to allow Israel to move forward with these actions towards us and towards other elements of Palestinian society, and the expansion of the settlement enterprise at the same time. All of these things show that the international community is failing in its duties, and that sends a message to others within the international community that if you have the power to violate the law and you have political allies that support you, then you're able to get away with it. And that sends a wrong message in the long term for the credibility of the international system as a whole.
I know that all of the 6 organizations receive international donor funding. Could you speak a little bit about what effect this decision has had on your funders, what questions they have asked, if any, and what evidence they have been shown, again, if any, in terms of responding to this Israeli decision?
Again, the Palestinian civil society functions on a large basis from international support, and as Sahar mentioned, the designations and the practical effect that it has had, the tangible consequences on our activity have been minimal. Israel has the ability to stop us at the border crossing, to raid our offices, to seize our assets, but it hasn't done these things. And this sends a message that really the target is not so much trying to go after us directly, because they can and they haven't done that, but they've chosen to go a more indirect approach, and that challenges that flow of international support and finance. And they're taking the use of the term terrorism as if that alone will instir fear within the international support system of solidarity, and leave us isolated and unsustainable. And really what Israel is playing off of is behavioral psychology. It's trying to secure the capitulation of those that are enabling the oppressed to resist the oppressor, and not because conviction and belief in the truth that Israel is presenting, rather because of fear. And in the behavioral response of fight or flight, Israel is simply betting on flight, that those members of the international community that support Palestinian civil society, and we can't overgeneralize, of course, different funders have different positions, but there is various risk tolerance and risk aversion that exists within the different actors, and each one is going to make its own assessment and trying to gauge what risks are associated with this designation, whether they believe in it or not, because of the ramifications that it has and the potential implications within the international finance system. Because in the end, a financial transfer is going through various financial institutions, and those financial institutions operating as private institutions have their their own discretion to make their own risk assessment. And a compliance officer sitting at a compliance desk in a financial institution making an assessment, looking at this information with regard to Israel's designation, will definitely take that into consideration in their risk assessment. Now, where the international community can play a role is countering that element, that variable, with other information that mitigates that risk and provides the political cover for supporting those financial institutions to allow those transfers to continue to go through.
So what are your predictions about the consequences of this going forward based on what you've seen so far, including the effects on civil society activism more broadly, both in Palestine and in the international solidarity community, and also among states that have been supportive of Palestinian rights? Maybe start with Sahar on that, and we'll come back to Wissam.
I think other aspect of the use of the Israeli anti-terror law is actually for this purpose, in order to terrify international organizations and donors and supporters that they dare to continue to work with us and fund us, and especially if they have offices in the occupied territories and they have people located and work in the occupied territories. By activating the Israeli civil law is actually enabling the state to implement and to sue and to go legally after these groups in order to criminalize them that they supported terrorism via continuing the support for our work. And this is why we feel like the impact would be coming later, like in a couple of months, if this decision, if the both decisions according to the anti-terror law and the military orders were not revoked and cancelled immediately, with the Israeli strategy to keep it there, but not to implement it immediately against us, Palestinian organizations, by closing our offices physically, arresting us, and so on. This would mean that in the long term, people would start fear and hesitate, and it will affect their decisions, because this is what will happen. And this is why for us, it's a very dangerous step, especially if really donors and especially like state donation and more the UN bodies. So far, no, the UN was very supportive and all the different programs were continuing. But the question would be how long they can continue in such a position. And this is what we fear, because it will affect not just us, the sex. Such decisions and such risk management would affect the whole Palestinian civil society, because the main problem here that we said the clear evidences that they submitted for us cannot prove anything. And starting to designate organizations and to attack organizations based on secret information, it will not stop just against these 6 organizations, because it's related to the kind of work that we are doing as well. So the moment that other work will threat the interest of Israel, whether in Area C, whether in Sheikh Jarrah, whether in other areas, other organizations that are trying to do the work would be attacked. And if the international community will allow this to happen, would mean that very soon, most of the civil society in Palestine wouldn't be able to continue to defend Palestinian rights and seek accountability and justice by using the international tool, according to the international law.
Yes, and in fact, it is the very fact of Palestinian organizations, and these 6 organizations in particular, being so effective in continually publicizing the violations at the international level that has prompted this last decision. And Wissam, so you've talked about the challenges on due process grounds, the challenges to secret evidence in the Israeli courts. Can you speak a bit about what the NGOs and the Solidarity Movement are doing to combat the designation internationally? What other efforts are being taken to challenge this?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, we have taken the approach to ensure that what is happening to us is publicized to the greatest extent possible. And the campaign was launched, Stand with the 6, which highlights the work of the different organizations and provides specific calls for people to take action, to amplify our messages, to reach out to members of their political community to take action, and not stand silent. And I think that has had an effect in pushing back against Israel's move. But there is a time issue as well. We are independent, non-governmental organizations operating on an annual budget as opposed to a state budget with a straight strategy that we are countering. And so over time, even if our financial support is hindered for a few months, that can have a significant impact on our ability to function in the long term. Nevertheless, I think the bigger challenge and issue that needs to be taken into account is the message that this attack on civil society by Israel is sending to those that might be watching, that are thinking about going into the area of human rights and international law. And the message that this is sending is that no matter which path with regard to resistance against an occupying power you might take, if you use international law and human rights mechanisms in a way that challenges Israel's policy, you will end up being designated as a terrorist. And so the functioning of the human rights regime and international mechanisms, these tools, in order to continue to provide a sense of hope for those oppressed, seeking to find an avenue that levels the playing field, these actions send the contrary message, that these mechanisms, no matter how you use them, in the end, they will fail you if you are in an asymmetrical power context. And I think that is a very dangerous world that we would see developing if that message continues to resonate.
You've pointed out the really enormous, broader consequences of this beyond Palestinian NGOs and Palestinian work. I mean, my experience with working with Tibetan refugees and Sahrawi reminds me that these kinds of decisions from a state, if they're supported by the international community, mean that similar decisions by other states will also be ignored or allowed. So I think that's a really important point in terms of the huge ramifications of this for all human rights work going forward. But I think our audience would like to know a little bit more about the most recent efforts by AlHaq and all of the other Palestinian organizations at the International Criminal Court that have been seen as rather breakthroughs, pioneering work, not only at the International Criminal Court, but also in the treaty bodies. If you could speak a little bit more about what these latest strategies have been on the Palestinians' part that I think have played a huge role in Israel making this decision.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our work at the International Criminal Court is without doubt one of the key variables in pushing along Israel's move with this designation, because it is when we are challenging Israel at the international level and challenging its legitimacy and countering its actions and pushing against its impunity that it enjoys, it exposes the hypocrisy between the narrative that it tries to portray to the international community and its actions. And these issues of pushing forward towards accountability through the International Criminal Court, using human rights treaty bodies, the Convention Against Apartheid is another important example where the narrative of apartheid has become more mainstream in the discourse with regard to Israel's practices. And this is within a broader context of colonialism and challenging that economic incentive structure and the role of multinational corporations, and actually going after corporations in their jurisdictions abroad as well. And I think, especially for the American audience that might be listening, it's important to think back to the American Revolution and the Boston Tea Party, and it was a British East India Company ship that docked at the harbor that was attacked by American revolutionaries at the time. And obviously the British colonial empire did not take that very well. And these issues that were faced hundreds of years ago continue to be faced today between the colonizer and the colonized, and how we view the different dimensions and the different means and methods that are used to try to maintain this imperial ambition and the colonial practices. And this is obviously not to dismiss the nature of American colonialism within the U.S. Towards the Native Americans as well. But in different portions in time, we have to look at the way international law has evolved to dictate the rules through which humanity engages. And colonialism was part of international practice, whether we liked it or not, but it was unfortunately an acceptable practice. And so was the slave trade until it wasn't. And colonialism, the same. But now we have, within a current modern day context, after the Geneva Conventions of 1949, you have a practice of international law that has developed to prohibit colonialism, and you have the practices of Israel as an occupying power under the umbrella of international law, continuing to implement these practices of colonialism using different means and methods, whether it's through corporations, but also let's not forget the role that technology plays in advancing this colonial endeavor, because the Palestinian people are also used as a laboratory for research and development, and the development of technology that is used to oppress the Palestinian people, but also exported abroad. And so that economic incentive structure leads Israel to get a message from the international community that its practices are acceptable because it is reaping a reward from that action. And again, the behavioral response of reward for action is to continue that action. Mm-hmm. So we can't forget the use of Pegasus spyware that was discovered in the course of this whole recent context. And in fact, we were aware of the use of Pegasus spyware before the designation came out. And our initial reaction was, because we discovered its use, Israel moved forward with this designation to try to stifle the investigation with regard to its use of Pegasus spyware as well.
We're coming close to the end of our time, but I wanted to ask both of you what specific message you would have for our US-based audience in terms of what other members of civil society can do to challenge this decision, to support the organizations, to pressure members of Congress. What suggestions you have for our audience to support you in this struggle?
Yeah, thanks, Susan. I think I would highlight as well the fact that the Special Rapporteur on the UN level for the anti-terror context highlighted in her reaction for our case that there is manipulation of the anti-terror laws and treaties in the international level by this step by the Israeli government. And this is why it's very important to put it in context with what was developed as well couple of years since September 11th in the United States in such rules and decisions that were taken against tens of organizations in the United States and elsewhere. And this is why it should be discussed and reviewed, all these measures taken by governments, whether really they are respecting the international law and international standards in order to fight against terrorism, or they are used in order to oppress and a kind of a tool against opposition or people that they are struggling and fighting for their self-determination, like in our context. And this brings me for the importance of the work of civil society in the United States, whether working in prisoners or in other contexts, in order to support our struggle against such policies and decisions, and like not just the use of technology that is shared by the Israeli government or Israeli spyware companies with the international context. When we talk about torture, for example, in our work in ADDAMEER, we can find lots of similarities between torture techniques that were used in the occupied territories and in other contexts in the American Iraqi prisons or in other areas. So this is why we have to join efforts on the global level in order to fight against such development on these human rights violations and war crimes and other crimes committed against different groups in different war contexts or occupations. And I would encourage people in the United States to pressure the State Department, to pressure the Congress not to accept this decision by the Israelis, especially because it's not based on clear evidences against the organizations, but rather against based on secret information, and not allow it to continue, and to pressure the decision-making level in the United States to pressure Israel to cancel the decision, because I think the importance in the United States position is affecting the financial system that Wissam was describing earlier. The whole banking system would be affected in the world by the position taken by the United States. And the silence for long, it will not be supportive for us. The opposite, it will cause us more complications. So this is why a clear decision by the United States should be taken, and to say it clear that they couldn't find any evidences and that they reject the Israeli designation.
Thank you. And I think you also raised another important point, the point of intersectionality of human rights work, the bridges that crosses from country to country, and especially these commonalities between torture issues that are being raised by human rights activists in the United States, torture issues in Palestine, but also on the positive side, the intersectionality of, for example, I know that many human rights organizations in the United States have come out with statements and strategies in support of the designated organizations. So that is a really important point for, I think, people who watch, for example, programs like this, but then say, what can I do? And maybe Wissam, you could also speak a bit to that.
Well, I mean, Sahar mentioned the connection between U.S. actions in different places and what we are facing here, and I think it's important to keep in mind that the injustices facing the Palestinian people are microcosm of global injustices, and there's a quote from the late champion of justice Desmond Tutu that if you are neutral in the situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. And this resonates now after his passing within our context as well, because we see this intersectionality. We see the use of terrorist designations being used by authoritarian regimes, fascist regimes, and even democratic institutions. It is a tool that is pulled out when the opposition to power makes headway, and this is the state of the situation that we are in. And I think the most important thing is that for an American audience or civil society in general around the world is to not allow this situation facing Palestinian civil society to be compartmentalized and exceptionalized, and see it within its broader context, connected to its own struggles of injustice, see the connections and highlight those connections. And one of the important strategies has also been to contextualize what is happening within the Palestinian context and connecting it to other contexts as well, whether historically or within the contemporary present. The Palestinian situation today is today's contemporary form of colonialism, that those that are critical of colonialism of the past, that did not have a chance to address it in the past, can do so today, addressing this contemporary manifestation of colonialism through the new means and methods that are available to civil society at an international level. And condemning alone is not going to be sufficient. There has to be practical action taken to challenge Israel's policy, to deal with the Palestinian civil society as if this designation is not there, to engage with Palestinian civil society, to continue to support it, and deal with the obstacles that Israel might put in its way. But those obstacles need to be overcome, and the international civil society and civil society within the U.S. plays an important role in overcoming those obstacles. And with us, we know we will be able to overcome these challenges.
I think we've come to the end of our hour, and I want to thank you both on behalf of myself and the Arabic Hour for both a rich but also very sobering discussion. And I hope our next discussion is one on the other side of this decision, with a revoked decision and the flourishing of your organizations. I know that all these 6 organizations are going to survive one way or another, because you all are amazing strugglers. So thank you so much. This was a wonderful opportunity to interact with both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.